The Ten Tails has always been a scary entity, having the power to reshape the land itself, create cataclysms, and even displaying chakra levels comparable to the size of a small planet. That is no simple feat, but what's crazy about this is that this Ten Tails isn't even the strongest of its kind. You see, Boruto's manga introduced a new Ten Tails, referred to as a juvenile, and there's a reason for that. But what's most important is that this Ten Tails was later able to create entities rivaling the power of characters stronger than Jigen, the same Jigen who far surpassed the power of Kaguya Otsutuki, the same Kaguya who merged with the Ten Tails from the original series. So if the Ten Tails in Boruto's manga is considered a juvenile tail beast, why is it seemingly more powerful than Kaguya's mature Ten Tails? Well, the answer to that question is a bit more complex, because the Ten Tails in Boruto isn't necessarily more powerful than the original, but there's a component that makes the shinjus it's able to produce a tad bit overpowered. You see, the basic concept of how the Ten Tails acquires power is very simple. An Otsutsuki travels to a planet, plants a Ten Tail seedling, which then transforms into a divine tree after consuming an Otsutsuki. It then spreads its roots across said planet, absorbing all existing life forms, including the natural energy of the planet itself. This is very important to note because the quality of said energy determines the potency of the chakra fruit the Ten Tails produces, which also means that it determines how strong that Ten Tails becomes. So in the context of the original Ten Tails, it was able to consume an Otsutsuki and absorb enough energy from the planet to form a chakra fruit. It then later merged with Kaguya herself before being divided into the 9 Biju by Hagoromo. This means that not only does the Ten Tails in the latter half of Shippuden possess the power of the sacrifice Otsutsuki and the planet itself, but it also possesses the power of Kaguya. Mind you, at this point in the series, it was already emitting power scaling to the size of a small planet, and that's without the power of the 9 and 8 tails that resided within Naruto, the 4th Hokage, and Killer Bee. This is the same 9 tails that eclipsed the power of all the other Bijus combined, while only having half of its original power. And you'd think that it didn't get any stronger than this, but it then went on to gain half of the 9 tails and a huge portion of the 8 tails, and even gathered more energy from the planet itself and its inhabitants through infinite Tsukunomi. So by the end of Naruto, the Ten Tails was immensely overpowered, but at the same time the characters who possessed the power of the Ten Tails weren't, well, at least in comparison to Boruto characters. You see, it is widely accepted that Fused Momoshiki scales above Kaguya, and the narrative portrays that to be the case as well. Now we can argue the case of Base Momoshiki and Kinshiki given their showing, which I think is a bit more arguable on an individual basis, but that's not really relevant because you have characters such as Jigen and Ishiki who far surpasses both of them in feats and narrative implications. So suffice to say that if a character surpasses Jigen, for example, they must also surpass Kaguya, thus also surpassing the Ten Tails Kaguya possessed. This then leads us into the shinjus that were introduced in chapter 4 of Boruto 2 Blue Vortex. These beings were formed after the Claw Grimes code created using the body of the Ten Tails started to devour non-Otsutsukis, thus turning into failed mini-divine trees per se. This allowed them to pretty much hijack the powers and lightness of the person they devoured, along with certain key characteristics. Now you'd assume that these guys would be relatively powerful, but not so much, given the fact that the Ten Tails they receive their power from is considered a juvenile. And the reason why that's the case is because it hasn't consumed an Otsutsuki, which means that it hasn't evolved into a divine tree, which also means that it hasn't absorbed the life force of a planet. All the things Kaguya's Ten Tails did twice. So it was a bit surprising when these entities were able to go toe-to-toe with Boruto himself. Mind you, Boruto scales greatly above Jigen while in base. That's because he was able to bully No Limiter Code, who's also stated to have greatly surpassed Jigen's combat power back in the original manga. Now, it's widely debated as to whether Code surpasses Ishiki Otsutsuki as well, which would also then get Boruto above Ishiki levels of power. The issue with this is that the manga made it a point to say that the cyborgs surpassed Jigen, not Ishiki, multiple times. And though one could argue that they did that because Ishiki wasn't a thing as yet, so the benchmark for the power system was Jigen at that time. That still doesn't explain why post-Jigen and Ishiki, the writers still had Shikamaru saying that Code's power should still be below Ishiki Otsutsuki. Now there's no other purpose for this comment aside from the author reinforcing that Ishiki hasn't been surpassed. Because from a storytelling perspective, the only other purpose this could have served was to prove him wrong by having Code show that he isn't below Ishiki. But that hasn't happened. In fact, the next time we saw him, he was getting bodied by base Boruto, and just before that, he got bodied by another cyborg stated to be greatly above Jigen, not Ishiki. So while I don't really care either way, he could be stronger than Ishiki, which would upscale Boruto as well, but the feats and statements so far doesn't back up that notion as of now. So that aside, the main point is that Boruto surpasses Jigen by beating an above Jigen level character. So this also simply means that when you have the bug Shinju tagging Boruto through multiple structures before he could dodge, tanking his lightning release, forcing him to escape using FTG, and even asking Code for assistance, it obviously means that these Shinjus scale above Jigen as well. Mind you, these are the feats from just the bug Shinju, who stems from a normal dude with no powers. So just imagine Hidari, who stems from Sasuke Uchiha, the Sasuke, and even Jura, the literal embodiment of the Ten Tails itself. I mean, you don't have to imagine because you've seen Hidari cancel out Boruto's Rasengan on a good day, something you wouldn't be able to accomplish without some level of relativity. Then you have Jura himself, who two-piece Karma Kawaki no diff Himawari and one-shot Boruto himself. So it's pretty clear where these characters scale in power. But why? Well, it's a combination of a few factors. You see, as noted by Boruto in chapter 6 of TBV, there's a strong possibility that Code's chakra is affecting them via the Cloudgrime. He also went on to say that Code may not be an Otsutsuki himself, but he did get a karma seal from Ishiki, which is a lump of Otsutsuki essence. So the karma seal having some effect wouldn't be a surprise. So two things were confirmed here. One is that the Cloudgrimes, and by virtue the Ten Tails and the Shinju, are indeed affected by Code's chakra and Ishiki's essence from karma. This is very important because, for one, Code is confirmed to have been implanted with the cells of Shibai Otsutsuki in chapter 13. This came in the form of Kashin Koji revealing that each member of Kara who were given enhanced modifications by Amado received transplants of Shibai's cells. And as a result, Code manifested claw marks, Daemon received reflection, and Ada awakened omnipotence. All of these abilities being Shibai's own Shinjutsu. Now, it didn't just give them abilities, but also increased their power levels, which is why you had characters like Delta keeping up with Six Paths Naruto and Daemon folding unlimited Code. This also indicates that the power wasn't distributed equally, since some received more power than the others. And as we know, Code had limiters placed on him because his power surpassed Jigen, which means that the power that became a part of the new Shinjus also surpassed Jigen. Now, it doesn't end there because it also states that they were affected by Ishiki Otsutsuki's essence within Code's karma. And what does Ishiki's karma provide Code? Well, that's raw power. So the power from Ishiki's karma, along with Code's own power that came from Shibai's cells, heavily contributed to the strength of the new Shinjus. Which is crazy, by the way, since only one of those power sources would have been enough to surpass the likes of Kaguya, even while she was merged with the original Ten Tails. Though it doesn't end there because there is another component. You see, as stated in Boruto chapter 14, each one reflects the chakra of the person devoured by the Ten Tails and turned into a tree. This simply means that they also receive power from the individuals that were devoured, which means that whatever Sasuke's power level was at the moment of consumption also contributed to the strength of the Shinju. Now, it's not clear if the power is evenly spread to every single Shinju, or if it's concentrated in the Shinju who takes the form of the devoured individual. Either way, this power they're able to take from through the consumption of that person's chakra. So in a sense, the Ten Tails in Boruto by itself isn't necessarily stronger than the one from Shippuden. On a mechanic level, that just wouldn't make sense. It is a juvenile Ten Tails that hasn't consumed an Otsutsuki and hasn't fed on the power of a planet. So the real reason why the Shinjus that were created from the body of this Ten Tails are so overpowered is more so due to the circumstances behind its evolution, which would be the mixture of Ishiki's chakra from Code's karma, Shibai's power within Code's body, and even the chakra of the consumed individuals. Now, it's also important to know that these power sources being a part of these evolved entities doesn't automatically make them equal to the person the power stems from. So Shibai's power being a part of these shinjus doesn't make them as strong as Shibai, and the same goes for Shiki's power. The same way Code himself isn't Shibai or Shiki level even though he has a portion of their power. The key takeaway is that it's only just a portion of that power that was divided into over 1,000 Clawgrimes that are still alive, by the way. It's similar to how Naruto shared his chakra with the entire Shinobi Alliance in the war. It did make them significantly stronger, but they weren't exactly on Naruto's level of power. So while one can, and I'm sure a lot will, make the argument that at least Jura, the embodiment of the Ten Tails itself, is a Shiki level, that doesn't have to be the case, but it can be. Typically when it comes to shonen, the next villain is always stronger than the one that came before him, at least 97% of the time. But in this case, it doesn't have to be that way, since the characters never actually eclipse the Shiki in power, aside from Barenmo Naruto that no longer exists. So the story can take a different route in regards to the power ceiling if it really wants to. Now with that in mind, which I think is almost certainly the main reason behind the power of the Shinju, what are some other possibilities? Well, one would be the likelihood that this new Ten Tails isn't really a juvenile, or at least it wasn't always a juvenile. You see, the Ten Tails has one purpose, which is to consume the energy of a planet after consuming an Otsutuki, but it never explained what happens after that process has been completed. This is very important because the size of the Ten Tails is determined by the amount of power it holds, which is why Sasuke referred to the Ten Tails as a juvenile. It does have 10 tails, but it isn't as big as the original 10 tails. By the way, this aspect is also reflected in the other Bijus as well. I mean, Kurama was noted to have significantly shrunken in size by the third Hokage when Minato used the Death Reaper seal to extract half of its chakra. The same thing happened when Naruto defeated the Nine Tails in Shippuden and extracted a portion of its chakra in that moment as well. Now you could also include the fact that Kurama returned as a literal infant after all of his chakra burnt out due to Baren mode. But you could also argue that he looks like this because he was just literally reborn. So you know what, it's fine. Anyways, the point is that the extraction of power or chakra from a Biju is directly tied to the size of said Biju. We also saw that with the Ten Tails drying up and reverting to the Geto statue form after Agoroma extracted its chakra and created the 9 Biju. And even the Ten Tails in Boruto doing the same thing after Code did something similar to create his 1000 plus Clawgrimes. So with that in mind, or with all of that in mind, it wouldn't surprise me if Boruto's Ten Tails did consume an Otsutsuki once before, and even absorb the power of a planet. It then went on to form chakra fruits, which is a concentration of that power, which was then consumed by the Otsutsuki who planted it. It then proceeded to do this over and over again until it didn't have any power left to create chakra fruits, which is why Jigen feeds on his remaining chakra using his karma seal. This then caused the Ten Tails to shrink over time since his own chakra was being siphoned without a way for it to get replenished. So while the Ten Tails decreased in chakra quantity over time, the potency of that chakra remained, which is why Jigen thought it useful to go absorb that chakra before fighting Naruto, and also why the Shinjus created by that Ten Tails are so powerful. This makes perfect sense, by the way, because the quality of power a Ten Tails is able to gain from absorbing the life of a planet is purely dependent on the quality of life on said planet and the amount of energy the planet itself produces. So it could simply be the case that whatever planet Boruto's Ten Tails devoured simply had a larger and richer population, or maybe the planet itself was just simply bigger and generated more power, which in turn means that the quality of power it received from that planet is simply greater than what Naruto's Ten Tails took from theirs, especially since it didn't actually devour all life on the planet or the planet itself. So the writer could go this route and it would make perfect sense since we've already seen the Ten Tails in Naruto revert forms even after becoming a divine tree, so anything is possible. Boruto's Ten Tails is an intriguing entity, isn't it? I mean, it was able to create entities far more powerful than they should have been. It was somehow able to obtain kaiju-sized porcelain veneers, and to an extent the true history of the Ten Tails is still a mystery. Now, for all intents and purposes, this is all by design. The author wants you to think, imagine, deliberate, ruminate. He wants you to use your brain cells, fire those neurons, and that's what I'm gonna do today. You see, chapter 17 of Boruto 2 Blue Vortex revealed something quite interesting, which is that the Ten Tails is still alive. This came in the form of Matsuri stating that according to the trees, Boruto himself placed the toad here, and really went on to question what she meant by trees, which she then replied to by saying that they're everywhere, even deep below the ground. And by using the tree's voices to track him, we'll be sure to run into him or perhaps his accomplice. Now this is really interesting because most deserts are not primarily sand but rather exposed bedrock, so trees typically would be rooted in the soil beneath the surface, not completely buried under sand. So what tree is Matsuri referring to, and why is she able to hear its voice? But this goes back to what happened to the original Ten Tails and its connection to the one in Boruto. You see, a lot of people miss this, but Jura said something very important in chapter 5, which is that the shinjus might be one unit biologically speaking, but Matsuri's emotion seems to be hers alone. He then went on to say that, in short, while we're still a single existence known as the Divine Tree, we each still possess independent consciousness. Now the reason why this is important is because it implies that even though these entities possess individual traits and personalities, they still stem from the same entity, which is why there still remains a biological connection. This also remains true for the original Ten Tails as well, because as I pointed out in my prior videos, there's this one databook statement which says that the Ten Tails is nothing but a fragment of the God Tree that gave birth to the universe, which implies that every Ten-Tail seedling is connected to the original God Tree, which in turn makes them connected to each other, biologically speaking. So it isn't far-fetched to assume that Matsuri, a fragment of a divine tree, is able to communicate with fragments of another divine tree. Now with that said, how does this connect to the original Ten-Tails? Well, a lot of people tend to forget this, but the Ten-Tails in Naruto still has roots spreading across the entire planet. This first happened when Kaguya came to the planet and cultivated her divine tree, because as stated by Amado in chapter 46, the divine tree is planted in the ground and its roots then grows deeply, reaching across every corner of the planet, just like a mold in your bathroom. That is how it sucks the chakra from every living thing on the planet. We also saw this happen in the anime as well, and was later confirmed to be draining energy from places such as Mount Miyaboku. So it isn't too crazy to assume that the roots also reach the land of wind as well, which is what Matsuri is utilizing to locate Boruto. Now, if we are paying attention, of course, there's one problem with this theory, which is that Matsuri didn't say that the roots told her where Boruto was. She specifically said the trees. So how does this make any sense? Well, that's where a thing called root sprouts comes in. You see, root sprouts often grow from adventitious buds found on a tree's extensive root system. Oh, and by the way, adventitious buds is the formation of a plant organ in an unusual place. So root sprouts are pretty much clones of a parent plant, and they can be found a significant distance from the parent plant. They can also grow from the roots of a tree that has fallen or been cut down, such as, well, the divine tree itself. And this part is really important because we've always wondered why Kaguya was surrounded by multiple divine trees in that one panel, or why Momoshiki's planet had multiple divine trees planted at the same time. This then led us to assume that Momoshiki simply had multiple Ten-Tails in his possession, or he simply reused the same Ten-Tails over and over again on the same planet, when in truth the root system of the divine tree simply sprouted copies of itself across the entire planet, which then grew to perform a similar function of the original divine tree. This would also explain why Momoshiki was able to sprout a divine tree in one of his dimensions back in chapter 5, which he then attributed to the chakra he stole from the Eight-Tails. What this means is that a plant organ of the Ten-Tails can be used to mimic the function of the actual Ten-Tails, likely to a much smaller extent. And simply feeding potent chakra to this root sprout, which is what Momoshiki did with the Eight-Tails chakra, can cause it to grow quickly into a fully formed divine tree. Now the next most important question would be, why would Momoshiki feed the Eight-Tails chakra to this divine tree instead of just consuming it himself? Well, the most likely answer to this is that the root sprout can be used to absorb some genetic information and energy from the planet it is planted on, which yields more benefits than simply consuming the chakra of the Eight-Tails. This is also why Momoshiki didn't consume the chakra he took from Kurama until it was completely necessary. He was more than likely planning on using it to create more divine trees, using the root sprouts he has collected. It also explains why we never saw Momoshiki with an actual Ten-Tails, despite the opening scene depicting him consuming a chakra fruit. And even in his fight back in chapter 7, the god tree never reverted back to the Ten-Tails, despite being cut in half, nor did Momoshiki try to summon it for assistance when he clearly needed it. So the most likely case is that this god tree isn't an actual Ten-Tails, but instead a root sprout Momoshiki grew using the chakra of the Eight-Tails, as he stated in the novels. This also implies that the root sprouts have the ability to become a divine tree without needing to consume an Otsutuki, likely because they stem from a god tree that has already underwent that process. So the trees Matsuri refers to in chapter 17 is likely multiple root sprouts that spawned from the roots of the Ten-Tails that cover the entire planet, Now, another supplementary piece of evidence to this would be the infinite Tsukunomi casted in the war. Even though the 10 tails was sealed inside Madara at the time, including the god tree itself, the roots of the god tree still remained active for some reason when the jutsu was casted. That is what then spread across the entire planet and wrapped around everyone, which implies that the root of the 10 tails is still functional while being severed from its head. This is even more blatantly implied when everyone remained connected to the root of the 10 tails, which also remained alive even after Kaguya and the body of the 10 tails was sealed away in another dimension. Naruto and Sasuke had to stop the jutsu itself for the root to release everyone from the vines that encased them. Now, going back to the root sprouts, there is actually an instance of this existing on the planet in Naruto. You see, back in chapter 512, Obito brought Kabuto to his underground facility where he revealed the husk of the 10 tails known as the Gedo statue, which was sitting on what appears to be a mini divine tree. This, of course, is the very same location Team 7 visited in Boruto episode 52, which is where they encountered the evolved White Zetsu. You can see that the bud the Gedo statue was sitting on is now closed. It has the same markings on the walls around it and the same structure to stand on in front of it. Also, the markings on the wall that leads to the root of the tree is the same, along with what's below the tree as well. So it is clear that this is indeed the same location Madara stored the army of White Zetsus, produced by what Mitsuki described as a bud. By the way, they also foreshadowed this back in Boruto's anime with Victor's fake divine tree. He was able to create it by using a sample of the real divine tree from the remnants of the war, which he then combined with Hashirama cells and implanted into individuals to essentially grow the divine tree using their chakra as fuel. Similar to how Momoshiki used the chakra of the 8 tails to grow the root sprout back in his dimension. With that said, I think I've substantiated why root sprouts are canon to the 10 tails to some extent, but what about the voices Matsuri heard? Is it that every root sprout has a separate consciousness similar to that of the 10 tails itself? Well, not necessarily. You see, according to current scientific understanding, trees don't have a consciousness in the same way that animals and humans do, as they lack a central nervous system and a brain. However, they can sense and respond to their environment, exhibiting behaviors some scientists interpret as a form of plant intelligence or awareness, though not necessarily conscious in the human sense. So plants instead use electrical signals to communicate with themselves, which some researchers see as a possible mechanism for information processing. This likely means that the voices Matsuri refers to in chapter 17 isn't meant to be taken literally. So the trees aren't using the English vocabulary to divulge information to Matsuri. It is instead sending electrical signals which Matsuri then interprets into words, since she's able to understand both. By the way, this also gives us an idea of what this location is exactly. They seem to be surrounded by roots of some kind, which they seemingly use to sustain thorn soul bulbs or produce them. I said because back in chapter 17, Juro retreated because he couldn't let Hidari's thorn soul bulb rot, yet they had Shinki's bulb connected to these roots waiting to be transformed, which implies that Juro could have connected Hidari to the roots which would have sustained him or chose to resurrect him using a combination of whatever that box is along with said roots. By the way, these are the same roots Hidari used to heal himself when his body was partially destroyed by Boruto's Rasengan, and likely what he was trying to escape to when he was hit by Rasengan Uzuhiko. So the roots seem to possess some sort of healing factor which can then be applied to the shinju, but why? Well, that is likely because this is a root sprout of the divine tree which is absorbing energy from the planet and then uses that to heal the shinju. This then brings us to what Koji said in chapter 13 as well, which is that it would be ideal to dispose of the 10 tails, root and branch before it evolves into the shinju, which implies that the shinju didn't create the root sprout. Granted, we are assuming that Koji is referring to the root sprout and not the phrase root and branch, which is used to express the thorough or radical nature of a process or operation. Though it could be the case that it's a double entendre, which is a word or phrase that is open to two interpretations, similar to the idiom blue-eyed boy Momoshiki uses with Boruto, which implies that Boruto's eyes will take everything from him. This both references Boruto's literal blue eyes and also his naivete, which led to the outcomes borne out by his decisions, thus Boruto taking responsibility for the position he forced Kawaki in. Though we are kinda off topic here, the point is that Koji made reference to the root and branch of the 10 tails, so he is likely aware of the root sprouts. Now there is more evidence to support why Matsuri would be able to connect to these divine trees in the way that she does. You see, Juro, who is stated to be the incarnation of the 10 tails itself, would in fact have an obsession with consuming Naruto over everyone else, since Naruto has the deepest connection to the Tail Beast. He's the one who tackled the hatred in Kurama and the Tail Beasts at large. He fought for them, protected them, and later granted them their freedom. This also goes back to why the Tail Beasts are able to converse and connect with each other no matter where they are. it's not just the fact that they came from the same 10 tails, but more so because every one of them is a part of the hive mind itself. What I mean by this is that every juvenile 10 tails that are shipped to planets across the universe came from one main body god tree, the one that produces them as stated in the databook. So Jura's connection to Naruto stems from the connection Naruto has to his fellow Biju, which is referring to the 9 Biju that derived from the original 10 tails. The crazy part about this is that the entire concept itself is inspired by Norse mythology, more specifically the world tree known as Yggdrasil. You see, the tree itself resides in the center of the cosmos and connects to each of the 9 realms, which, by the way, is similar to how the 10 tails or the god tree is connected to the 9 Biju. And I did mention this before in a prior video, but what I found most interesting in my research was the 3 main entities that resided below the roots of the world tree. One of them known as Nidhogg, a great serpent who resided in the spring called Vergilmir along with the other serpents. Then you have the Well of the Wise known as Mimir. By the way, this well is said to contain wisdom and intelligence, which is why Odin sacrificed one of his eyes in order to take a drink. Now lastly, we also have the Well of Earth, where the Norse equivalent of the Fates called Norns lived. These beings were pretty much responsible for using the water from their well to repair any damages done to the world tree. Now that said, what does all of this remind you of? Well, naturally, the first things that should come to mind would be the great animal sages. The serpent called Nidhogg obviously refers to the great snake sage. Mimir and the Well of Wisdom clearly refers to the great toad sage, and then we have the Norns, which refers to the slugs due to their shared healing capabilities. So Kishimoto didn't just take the bare concept of the world tree itself, he also incorporated the surrounding aspects of the world as well. So in a sense, everything within Naruto's universe spawns from one massive god tree that lies at the center of the cosmos, and all subsequent god trees are just fragments of it as stated in the databook. Now with that said, there's one issue with everything I just said, which is that it was recently revealed that the universe was created by an Otsutuki god using the power of omnipotence. But it was later revealed that this was a mistranslation. He didn't create the universe itself, just the current world. This reminds me of the Celestials from Marvel Comics, who created these planets and then planted their embryos within the core in order to absorb the energy over time. And once those embryos hatch, the planet and all life on it would come to an end, similar to the god tree. Now, with that said, I could be wrong, of course. It could be the case that Matsuri is just using some form of root system deep below the earth's surface, and she just called it trees instead of roots for some reason. It could also be the case that she's able to do it because of Moegi's ability to use wood release as stated in the character profile. So it's not really due to any connection to the 10 tails, but her being a divine tree just enhanced her sensory abilities. All of these options, of course, being way less exciting than what I said before, but it is what it is if it is. Though I do wonder that if you do have multiple sprouts growing beneath the Earth's surface, what exactly is happening to the planet itself? Will it eventually look similar to the planet Momoshiki devoured, or does Koji have a plan for that as well, thus the root and branch comment? It is interesting to say the least, but we'll see. With that said, that's it for the video guys. Let me know your thoughts down below. Of course, this is just a theory video. This is not a statement of fact. I could be wrong as I stated before, but I do think that even if this turns out not to be true, that Matsuri is using these root sprouts created by the 10 tails, it does still explain why Momoshiki had multiple 10 tails or multiple divine trees on his planet and why we had that panel with Kaguya. It does make sense from a scientific perspective, but of course, you could just go with the prior theory that Momoshiki just replanted the 10 tails over and over again, and that's why you had multiple divine trees. That of course could work as well. With that said, again, let me know your thoughts down below, drop a like if you liked it, and subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.